New Amsterdam was born, and so too were the beginnings of New York. The European exploration and colonization of the Americas began in earnest at the outset of the 16th century, as navigators from nations like Spain, France, and the Netherlands sought out new trade routes to these newly discovered and resource-rich territories. In 1524, the Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, sailing under the flag of France, became the first European to set eyes on the shores of what would one day become New York Harbor. Verrazzano claimed the area in the name of France, although any attempt to follow this up with colonial settlement failed to materialize. It would be almost another 100 years before Europeans would return to the area, and it would be the Dutch who would ultimately leave the first lasting impression on what would eventually become New York City. In 1609, the English explorer Henry Hudson, who was in the employ of the Dutch East India Company, had been tasked with finding the elusive Northwest Passage, purported to connect the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Whilst on this expedition, Hudson sailed up the northern river of New York Harbor, which now bears his name in honor of his discovery. He claimed the land on either side on behalf of the Dutch Republic, and in the process, established a foothold for future Dutch settlement and trade in the region. The following decades saw Dutch trading posts established along the banks of the Hudson River, as well as others dotted along the coastline stretching from the Delaware River to Cape Cod, which formed the wider territorial claims of the Dutch colony of New Netherland. Initially, these isolated dwellings and their occupants were focused entirely on the commerce produced by the fur trade. But in 1624, the Dutch West India Company decided to send a ship full of colonists to establish permanent civilian settlements in the region. They first landed on what is now Governor's Island, but were then dispersed amongst the chosen sites for settlement across the New Netherland. A small group was disembarked on the southern tip of Manhattan after it was decided to construct a fortification there to protect the entrance to the Hudson River and the valuable cargoes of the fur trade which passed upon it. With that, the foundations of Fort Amsterdam were laid out in 1625, and it quickly formed the epicenter of a new settlement which sprung up around it. New Amsterdam was born, and so too were the beginnings of New York. In 1626, with the hope of legitimizing their claim to the new colony, the Director General of New Netherland, Peter Minuit, purchased the land of Manhattan from a small band of local Lenape Indians in exchange for traded goods worth 60 guilders, roughly $1,000 in today's money. From here, the colony began to grow. Under Minuit's successor, Peter Stuyvesant, its population reached some 1,500 people by the year 1655. However, Stuyvesant was widely disliked by the settlers for the policies he introduced. These included regulations on alcohol sales, attempts to assert control over the Dutch Reformed Church, and the blocking of other religious groups such as Quakers, Jews, and Lutherans from establishing places of worship in the colony. The Dutch West India Company attempted to intervene by introducing more lenient policies and reforms. However, these plans were quickly interrupted by the outbreak of war. In the latter half of the 17th century, the Netherlands was locked in a fierce rivalry with England to become the uncontested maritime and commercial superpower of the age. Between 1652 and 1673, a series of three conflicts known as the Anglo-Dutch Wars saw Dutch and English fleets battle it out on the high seas for naval supremacy. It was against this backdrop in 1653 that the inhabitants of New Amsterdam decided to construct a defensive wall along the northern boundary of the settlement, modern-day Wall Street, to protect against potential attacks by English forces coming overland from New England to the north. Nevertheless, despite their best efforts to deter any would-be attacker, in 1664, the English sent a small fleet to wrest the entire colony of New Netherland and its capital of New Amsterdam from Dutch control. Stuyvesant was unable to call on any resistance and consequently surrendered the city without a fight. The English renamed Fort Amsterdam as Fort James, and the wider colony of New Netherland, as well as the city of New Amsterdam itself, as New York, in honor of James, the Duke of York, who would later become King James II. New York briefly fell under Dutch control again in 1673, but was quickly returned to the English under the Treaty of Westminster in 1674, which ended the series of hostilities between the two nations.